I keep my hands flat against the tablecloth, pressing my fingertips into the dense, cream-colored linen until I can feel the individual threads beneath my nails. That is the only thing I allow myself. Flat palms, still breath, the measured, deliberate architecture of a woman who has spent 15 years training herself not to react on instinct. My name is Callahan Reeves. Major Callahan Reeves, though no one in this room knows that yet, except for one man standing approximately 40 feet away from me, whose complexion has just rearranged itself into something I can only describe as a controlled devastation. But I am getting ahead of myself. I always get ahead of myself in the retelling, because the ending is the part that still makes me want to close my eyes and simply breathe. Let me start with his voice. My father has a particular register he uses when he wants a crowd to belong to him. I have studied it for 38 years, the way a forensic analyst studies a pattern of damage. It begins low and conspiratorial, drawing people inward, making them feel included in something exclusive, something warm. Then it rises. It climbs toward performance, toward the theatrical delivery of a man who spent 4 decades in middle management convincing himself he had the instincts of a general. By the time his voice reaches full elevation, the people nearest him are already laughing, already leaning in, already surrendered to the gravity of his approval. He had the microphone. He had 200 people. He had a drink in his right hand, something amber in a crystal lowball glass, the kind of glass that costs more than it should and communicates precisely that intention, and he was in the middle of what he had clearly rehearsed as a roast. A career retrospective dressed in the costume of humility and affection. "We have such talented children," he said, and he gestured broadly toward the room, toward the vague idea of family assembled among his colleagues and their spouses, and the extended architecture of a life he had curated for public admiration. Then his arm swung toward me. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I laced my fingers together beneath the table and pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, just hard enough to feel the precise grounding point of pressure, and I watched his face as he found me in the crowd. "Except that one," he said. The room did not stop. The room continued, ambient and warm and celebratory, because the words had not yet fully registered for most people, and he was still smiling, still performing, still in possession of the crowd. "You're a failed soldier. You should leave before you embarrass me." People laughed, not everyone, not even most, but enough. The nervous, uncomfortable laughter of people who have decided that agreeing with the person holding the microphone is safer than the alternative. I did not crumble. I did not reach for my water glass or press my lips together or do any of the small, readable things that would have told him he had landed the blow he intended. I simply registered the remark the way you register a wind reading before you decide on trajectory. Clinical, informational. He had just handed me something and he did not know it yet. I stood. That was the plan. That had always been the plan, not because he had broken me. Not because his words had found the soft architecture of self-doubt somewhere behind my sternum. I stood because standing was the correct tactical move in that moment, the one that would allow him to believe, for the next several minutes, that he had won. That his public reconstruction of me as failure, as embarrassment, as the kind of daughter a man gestures away from himself at his retirement party, had achieved its intended result. Let him think it. Let him stand at that podium with his amber drink and his crystal glass and his crowd, believing that he had, once again, successfully defined me in front of everyone who mattered to him. I pushed my chair back. I picked up my clutch, a small structured bag in cognac-colored Italian leather, with a single brass clasp that I had carried deliberately tonight because I knew the cameras would catch it, and I had wanted everything about my appearance to be composed, specific, and later, unmistakable in any photograph. I took 2 steps toward the edge of the ballroom. And then General Marcus Fowler stepped directly into my path. I have reconstructed the sequence of what followed so many times in the weeks since that I can now watch it almost as external observation, the way you watch a controlled demolition on a delayed feed, knowing exactly where the structure will collapse but still quietly stunned by the precision of it. General Fowler is a 4-star general, which is not a title or a rank that requires explanation in most rooms, and he was attending my father's retirement dinner as a personal guest, a distinction my father had mentioned no fewer than 4 times in the preceding weeks when he called my mother, and she relayed the information to me in the tone she uses when she is simultaneously proud of my father and indifferent to whether I am impressed. I had known General Fowler was going to be in the room. I want to be very clear about that. General Fowler's face had shifted into an expression of controlled attention when he stepped toward me, and I noticed, with the particular acuity that comes from years of threat assessment, that he was holding a name in his mouth the way a person holds something fragile, carefully, uncertain of its weight in this specific context. Wait, he said, his voice carried. Not because he projected it, but because voices that have commanded entire battalions develop a particular resonance, a frequency that cuts through ambient sound the way a tuning fork cuts through noise, without effort, without performance. Are you? He paused, one beat, two. Are you Major Upton? My father's last name is Upton. I kept it, not out of sentimentality. I kept it because I always understood that the name would eventually do work I could not do for myself, in a room I could not have manufactured, at a moment I could not have scripted better if I had spent a decade trying. Which, in a certain sense, I had. I watched my father's grip on the crystal lowball glass loosen by a fraction. I watched the glass tilt, just slightly, before he steadied it, and I noticed the small, controlled catastrophe of his knuckles adjusting around the crystal, white at the pressure points, the involuntary, physical advertisement of a man whose central narrative has just developed a structural fault. The microphone slipped. It hit the edge of the podium and produced a brief, sharp crack of feedback before someone from the catering staff stepped forward and caught the stand. 200 people turned toward my father. Then 200 people turned toward me. I did not smile. I did not perform vindication. I stood in the precise posture I have held in briefing rooms and forward operating bases and congressional hearings, weight distributed, chin level, eyes steady, and I extended my hand toward General Fowler with the measured, deliberate calm of a woman who has been waiting for this specific geometry for a very long time. Yes, sir, I said. Major Callahan Reeves Upton, it's an honor. This is the part where I have to be careful in the telling, because what followed is not a scene I experienced with the triumphant clarity that people tend to imagine when they hear the story later. There was no orchestral swell. There was no moment of cathartic release where years of silence and invisibility dissolved into something cinematic and clean. What there was, instead, was the quiet, almost academic satisfaction of watching an architecture collapse according to its own load-bearing failures. My father had built a version of me out of assumption and indifference and the particular arrogance of a man who never thought to ask. And that version of me, the failed soldier, the daughter worth gesturing away from, could not survive contact with the institutional truth of my actual record. General Fowler began speaking. He had the natural authority of a man who does not preface his sentences, who does not qualify or warm up his delivery, who simply begins with information as though the relevance of that information is not in question. He spoke about my deployment record. He spoke about my commendations. He referenced the action for which I had received the Distinguished Service Medal, and he did so by name and by theater, which meant that every person in that ballroom now had a specific, verifiable, public account of who I was, delivered not by me, not by anyone who loved me or owed me advocacy, but by a four-star general who had been attending my father's retirement party as a personal friend. The irony of that particular geography still produces something in me that I can only describe as a cold, structural satisfaction. Here is what I want you to understand about those 15 years of silence. People assume that silence is passive, that a woman who does not correct the record, who does not send the photographs or share the news or forward the citations, is a woman who has accepted the diminishment, that she has internalized the dismissal and folded it into her identity the way scar tissue folds into skin, invisible and permanent and no longer painful. That is not what I did. I was 23 years old when I enlisted, and my father stood in the driveway of the house I grew up in, the one with the split rail fence that he repainted every 3 years in the same weathered gray, and he told me that I would be back within 6 months. Not as a prediction, as a verdict. The tone was the tone of a man delivering information he considered settled, the way you tell someone the weather or the time, something you know and they should simply absorb without argument. I did not argue. I picked up my duffel bag. I put it in the back of the car that was waiting for me. I did not hug him because he had not offered it, and I had learned early and thoroughly that reaching for affection from a man who had not extended it was a form of self-erasure I was not willing to perform. I looked at the gray fence one more time, then I left. 6 months passed, then a year, then 6 years, my mother called occasionally. The conversations had a particular texture, brief and lateral, moving along the surface of things without pressure or inquiry. She would tell me about the renovation they were doing to the kitchen, about my younger brother Garrett's new job in insurance, about the neighbor's dog that had gotten into the garden again. She never asked about my rank. She never asked about my assignments. I do not believe this was cruelty. I believe it was the profound, inherited incuriosity of a woman who had spent 40 years in a marriage where the authority of assumption was so total that she had simply stopped pressing against it. I told her nothing. I sent her a Christmas card every year. A physical card, always the same style, a clean, uncluttered winter landscape from a printer in the Pacific Northwest, card stock at £97 per square meter with a matte finish that felt deliberate and expensive between the fingers. I signed it with my first name only. I never wrote a return address. That card matters. Remember it. The other thing I want you to hold on to is the glass. My father's crystal lowball glass, the one from which the amber drink nearly spilled when his grip loosened, the one I watched tilt at a fraction of a degree when the institutional weight of my record landed in the room. I had seen that glass before. It was part of a set of 8, a retirement gift from his department, hand-etched crystal with a small, engraved compass rose on the base. And the set had cost, according to the department's gift registry, which his assistant had circulated by email to everyone, including, accidentally, me, exactly $247.83. Less than a master sergeant's weekly hazard pay. He had carried it across the ballroom like a scepter. And the third thing. The third object I need you to file away with the same precision you would apply to an evidence log is this. On the table where I had been seated, directly to the left of my place setting, was a press packet. Cream-colored folder, embossed with the agency's logo in a matte navy blue, containing my father's official retirement biography, a curated narrative of 39 years of service to a federal contracting firm. I had arrived early enough to have reviewed the document in full before anyone else was seated. 3 pages, single-spaced, and my name appeared in it exactly 0 times. I had folded the press packet in half along its spine. I had placed it in my cognac leather clutch, next to my phone and my identification, and I had carried it into the ballroom with the quiet, settled certainty of a woman who has learned that the most lethal documents are the ones people believe no one has bothered to keep. That was the setup. Those were the pieces on the board. My father stood at the podium, unmade, while General Fowler continued speaking about a daughter he had never thought to ask about, and I felt the specific, architectural clarity of a moment that has been a very long time arriving. Not rage, not tears, not the spectacular, visible release that people expect from women who have been publicly diminished by the men who were supposed to protect them. Just the flat, clean recognition of a plan entering its second phase. I had not said a word in my own defense. I did not need to. The silence was the victory, for now. The ballroom emptied by degrees the way formal events always do, not all at once, but in the gradual, conversational drift of people who have had enough champagne to feel generous and not quite enough to stay. I watched it from a position near the east wall, close enough to the secondary exit to leave without production, far enough from the congratulatory cluster around my father to maintain the precise distance that looked like dignity rather than strategy. General Fowler had moved on to another conversation. He had shaken my hand, delivered his account of my record to the room, and then returned to the social machinery of the evening, because men like General Fowler do not linger over moments, they simply deposit them and move forward. My father had not looked at me again. That was, in its own way, the most informative thing that happened in the aftermath of the microphone drop. A man who wanted to repair something, or who felt the appropriate weight of what he had done, would have found a way to cross the room. He would have manufactured an approach, a casual redirection of foot traffic toward my corner of the ballroom, something he could execute without the appearance of surrender. He did not do that. He accepted a fresh drink from a passing server and returned to the cluster of his colleagues with the compressed, rearranged energy of a man who has decided the best response to structural damage is to perform as though the structure is still sound. I stayed for 47 more minutes. I want to be specific about that, because people who hear this story later tend to assume I left immediately, that the satisfaction of the moment was sufficient to carry me out the door and into whatever came next. That is not how I operate. I stayed because leaving too quickly would have read as discomfort, and I had not spent 15 years in forward operating environments learning to manage my readable signals only to surrender that discipline at a retirement party in a downtown ballroom. I spoke to 3 of my father's colleagues. I accepted a glass of sparkling water. I had a 7-minute conversation with my father's former department head about logistics infrastructure, which is a topic I know with professional precision, and I watched the man's expression move through polite engagement into genuine interest into the particular, startled attention of someone who has just realized the person they are speaking to is considerably more qualified on the subject than anticipated. I did not explain myself. I simply answered his questions accurately. Then I collected my cognac leather clutch from the table, nodded to my mother across the room, and left. She did not follow me out. I did not expect her to. The drive home took 22 minutes in low traffic, and I spent the first 8 of those minutes in a silence so complete that I could hear the particular vibration of the highway surface beneath the tires, the low, continuous frequency of asphalt at night, which has always been one of the sounds I associate with the specific quality of peace that follows the successful execution of a plan. Then I called Dominique. Dominique Harwell has been my closest friend since our second deployment, where we shared a forward operating base in conditions that strip away every non essential layer of a person and leave only the actual architecture of who they are. What I discovered about Dominique in those conditions is that she is one of the most practically intelligent people I have ever known, not in the academic, credential accumulating sense, but in the specific, tactical sense of a woman who reads situations with the accuracy of someone who has learned that misreading them has real consequences. She laughed when I told her what happened. Not the nervous, uncertain laughter of the people in the ballroom, but the full, genuine, unguarded laughter of a woman who had been told this story was coming for approximately 3 years. Tell me he didn't, she said. He did, I said, in front of Fowler, 40 feet away. There was a pause, then she said, Cal, you need to call Merritt. I had already been thinking about Merritt for the last 14 minutes. Attorney Sylvie Merritt is not someone you retain casually. She is a civil litigation specialist operating out of a practice in the financial district, and she came to me by way of a referral chain that began with a colleague who had used her to manage an estate dispute of the kind that involves a family home, a contested will, 3 siblings, and a piece of property documentation that everyone agreed meant something different. She had resolved it in 11 weeks. The other side had arrived at the mediation table with a team of 4 attorneys and left with considerably less than they had entered, believing they were entitled to. I had taken that referral, called her office, and had a preliminary conversation 7 months before the retirement party, during which I laid out in precise, clinical terms the specific legal and financial situation I was anticipating, and she had listened for 24 minutes without interrupting me, which is, in my experience, the reliable indicator of an attorney who is actually processing information rather than performing attentiveness. I'll call her in the morning, I told Dominique. Don't wait until morning, Dominique said. I did not wait until morning. The family dinner was scheduled for the following Saturday. My mother had been planning it for 6 weeks, which I knew because she had mentioned it during 2 of our calls, always in the lateral, surface moving tone she uses for neutral information, telling me about the menu she was considering and whether she should use the good china or save it for a holiday. The ostensible purpose was to continue the celebration of my father's retirement, to move it from the public, performance oriented space of the ballroom into the private, domestic space of the family home, where the social dynamics are different and, for certain people in our family, considerably more comfortable. I knew what the dinner was actually for. My father's younger brother, my uncle Dennis Upton, had been managing a joint investment account shared between my father and my maternal grandmother, Evelyn Marsh, for the preceding 11 years. The account held, as of the most recent statement I had been provided through a channel I will describe shortly, approximately $814,000 and no cents, a figure that had grown from an initial deposit of $450,000 that my grandmother had contributed when she liquidated a property in coastal Virginia 14 years ago. My grandmother was 81 years old. Her cognitive clarity had begun to show, in the past 18 months, the particular, uneven erosion that her neurologist had described to me privately as consistent with early stage vascular decline, meaning that there were days when she was entirely herself and days when the retrieval of certain information required more effort than it once had. Dennis Upton had noticed this. I had noticed Dennis Upton noticing this. The dinner was, in my operational assessment, the moment he intended to move the account restructuring from the planning stage to the execution stage, using the warmth and celebratory energy of my father's retirement as the social cover under which documents might be signed. Decisions might be framed as having been made collectively, and my grandmother's name might be formally moved from a position of joint authority to something considerably more advisory and considerably less protected. I arrived at my parents' house at 6:47 in the evening, which was 3 minutes before the official start time my mother had communicated, which is itself a form of information delivery. A woman who arrives slightly early to a family event that she has been quietly studying for months is a woman who wants to see the room before the room is fully assembled. The house smelled like it always smells, a particular combination of the cleaning product my mother has used on the hardwood floors for as long as I can remember, something with a faint cedar base, and whatever she was cooking in the back kitchen, which tonight appeared to be the braised short rib recipe she reserves for occasions she considers significant. The table in the formal dining room was set for 11 people. Good china. The kind of detail that tells you the person setting, it considers this a performance. My Aunt Renata was already there. Renata Upton, who is Dennis's wife and therefore not technically blood, but functionally central to every financial maneuver Dennis has executed in the past 2 decades, was standing near the kitchen doorway holding a glass of white wine and wearing a dress that I can only describe as aggressively intentional. A structured wrap in a deep jewel-toned teal that would have been at home at a charity gala and was therefore several registers above what the occasion required, which is itself a form of communication. Renata dresses up when she expects to win something. I have observed this pattern over the course of many years, and I consider it among the most reliable behavioral tells I have encountered in a civilian context. She kissed me on the cheek. Callahan, she said, drawing my name out by a syllable in the particular way she uses when she is performing warmth for an audience that doesn't yet exist. You look wonderful, very. Understated, I did not register the diminishment. I noted it, the way you note a wind reading, and I set my clutch on the entryway table beside the ceramic bowl my mother keeps for keys. The cognac leather looked exactly as deliberate as I had intended it to look against the pale wood. Renata, I said, the dress is beautiful. She smiled with all of her teeth. My grandmother arrived 20 minutes later, helped through the front door by her caregiver, a quiet and competent woman named Polly, who had been with my grandmother for 3 years, and whose attentiveness I had always considered one of the more reliable protective factors in my grandmother's daily environment. My grandmother was wearing a blouse in a soft lavender with pearl buttons, and her hair was set in the way she has always worn it, precise and deliberate, because Evelyn Marsh is a woman who considers the management of her appearance a form of self-respect. And even on the days when the retrieval of certain information requires more effort, she has never once appeared at a family occasion without her hair exactly as she intended it. She saw me across the room, and her face arranged itself into the expression she uses specifically for me, a particular combination of recognition and something quieter underneath it, something I have always interpreted as a form of acknowledgement that exists between two people who see each other accurately in a family that has largely decided not to. There's my girl, she said. I crossed the room and took both her hands in mine. Her fingers were cool, the way they always are, and I held them for exactly the amount of time that felt like presence rather than performance. Dennis arrived last. Dennis Upton is 4 years younger than my father and has spent those 4 years trying to close a distance that is not actually about age. He is the kind of man who fills a room with volume rather than substance, who leads with a laugh and follows it with a claim, whose confidence is inversely correlated with the stability of whatever situation he currently occupying. He came through the door with the compressed, forward-leaning energy of a man who has been thinking about this evening for a long time and has decided it belongs to him. He shook my father's hand. He kissed my mother on the cheek. He clapped my brother Garrett on the shoulder in the particular way men use when they want to establish a lateral, collegial bond with someone they intend to use as a supporting vote later in the evening. Then his eyes found mine from across the dining room, and something in his expression adjusted by a fraction of a degree, just enough to tell me that he had not forgotten about General Fowler and the retirement party, and that he had decided it was a complication rather than a threat. He would revise that assessment, not tonight, but soon. Dinner proceeded with the particular texture of family events that are performing normalcy over a substructure of intention. My father sat at the head of the table and received the room's continued celebration of his retirement with the self-conscious pleasure of a man who has been briefly unseated from his own narrative and is working to reestablish occupancy. He told 2 stories I had heard before. He made a joke about fishing that produced the expected laughter. He did not reference the ballroom. He did not reference General Fowler. He did not look at me for longer than the social minimum required for someone seated at the same table. My mother circulated food and attention in equal measure, which is her specific domestic genius, the ability to manage the emotional temperature of a room through the continuous, generous distribution of physical care. She refilled glasses. She asked Renata about her sister's new house. She told Garrett that the short rib was the same recipe from the card box her own mother had left her, which produced the kind of small, warm moment that these dinners are designed to manufacture. I ate. I listened. I kept my hands quiet in my lap between bites, and I filed everything with the patient, systematic attention of someone who has learned that the most important information in any room is usually delivered in the moments when people believe they are not being assessed. Then Dennis set his fork down. This is a gesture I want you to understand precisely, because it was not the casual, mid-meal fork placement of a man pausing between bites. It was the deliberate, preparatory setting down of a man who has decided that the moment for the thing he came to do has arrived. The fork touched the china with a small, specific sound, and I felt the room's energy shift in the way a barometric pressure shift feels in the body before you can see the weather change. I actually wanted to take a minute, Dennis said, addressing the table with the warm, expansive tone of a man who has rehearsed this opening, to talk about something as a family. My grandmother looked up from her plate. Renata reached for her wine glass. The teal dress caught the overhead light. My father nodded with the familiar, reinforcing nod of a man who already knows the agenda. Dennis produced a folder from the bag he had brought to the table, cream-colored, printed documentation inside. He slid a set of pages toward my grandmother with the practiced ease of a man who has executed this particular motion before, in other configurations, with other family members who were not prepared for it. Mom, he said to my grandmother, because he addresses her as though she is his mother rather than his sister-in-law, a small, habitual territorial claim that he has been making for years. We've been talking about simplifying the account structure, just making things cleaner going forward. Easier to manage. My grandmother looked at the pages. She picked up the first one and held it at the angle she uses when the light is better for her eyes. I wasn't aware there was a problem with the current structure, she said. Her voice was measured, clear. This was a good day for her retrieval, and something in Dennis's expression registered the faint inconvenience of that. It's not a problem, Renata said, smooth and immediate, the verbal relay of a practiced team. It's just optimization. The way the account is structured right now, with joint authority, there are tax implications going forward that we could avoid with a simple restructuring. Dennis has been working with an advisor on this for months. My grandmother set the page down. She did not sign anything. She folded her hands on the table in the precise, deliberate way of a woman who has navigated a great many rooms and knows when she is being managed. I'd want my own attorney to review this, she said. The table produced a brief, collective pause, of the kind that occurs when a room has calculated an outcome and the outcome has not materialized. Then my father looked at me. And what I saw in his face at that moment was not the collapsed, undone expression from the ballroom. It was something different, something older and more settled, the particular expression of a man who has decided that the person across the table from him is the source of the resistance he is encountering, and that the most efficient way to neutralize that resistance is to do it publicly, in front of the family, in the domestic space where he has always held the most authority. He set his own fork down. "This doesn't concern you, Callahan," he said. I did not respond. I picked up my water glass with my right hand and took one measured sip and set it back down on the tablecloth, directly on the ring it had already made, and I watched his face while he decided whether my silence was submission or something else. He decided it was submission. "Come back here after years of radio silence," he said, and his voice had found its elevation, the performance register, the one calibrated for an audience, even an audience of 10 people at a family dinner table, and you sit at this table like you have some kind of standing. You couldn't even manage a basic military career. You're a failure, Callahan. You have always been a failure. The only thing you've ever done successfully is disappear. The table was very quiet. Garrett stared at his plate. My mother set down the serving spoon. My grandmother's hands tightened against each other on the tablecloth, and I noticed, with the precise attention I was giving to everything in that room, that her knuckles had gone white in a way that had nothing to do with frailty and everything to do with controlled fury. I did not stand. I did not raise my voice. I placed my right hand flat on the tablecloth, pressing my fingertips into the linen the way I had pressed them into the cream-colored tablecloth at the ballroom, feeling the thread count beneath my nails, and I performed a single, deliberate clinical observation of my father's face while he waited for my reaction. The small vein above his left temple, the one that has always been visible when his blood pressure elevates, was standing out against the skin with the particular prominence of a man who has committed to a performance and is now waiting for the confirmation that it has achieved its intended effect. I gave him none. I understand, I said, and my voice was the voice I use in briefing rooms, level and clear and entirely without the inflection of a woman who has been hurt, because I had made a decision a long time ago that my father would never again hear the sound of me being wounded by him. That particular sound was retired, filed away, permanently decommissioned. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. I looked at my grandmother. I'll call you tomorrow, Grandma Evelyn, I said. She looked at me with the direct, clear attention of her good days. I know you will, sweetheart, she said, and the specific quality of those 5 words contained an entire private communication that no one else at the table had the context to translate. I collected my clutch from the entryway table where I had placed it when I arrived, the cognac Italian leather with the single brass clasp, and I walked out of my parents' house with the same measured, deliberate posture I had maintained in the ballroom, weight distributed, chin level, the complete outward architecture of a woman who has decided to leave rather than a woman who has been driven out. The distinction matters. It always matters. My car was parked at the curb. I sat in it for 11 seconds before I started the engine, not because I needed to compose myself, but because I needed to give the house one final look in the rearview mirror and confirm, for myself, that what I had just witnessed was exactly what I had anticipated it would be. It was. I drove 4 blocks, pulled to the curb under a streetlight, and called attorney Sylvie Merritt. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting the call. It happened tonight, I said. The account documentation, she said. He brought it to the dinner table. She didn't sign, but it won't stop there. No, Merritt agreed. It won't. I heard the clean, precise sound of a legal pad being positioned. Tell me exactly what was presented, I told her. I told her about the cream-colored folder and the pages Dennis had slid across the table toward my grandmother with the practiced ease of a man who has done this before in other configurations. I told her about Renata's immediate verbal relay, the tax implications framing, the optimization language. I told her about my grandmother's request for her own attorney and the specific way the table had received that request as an inconvenience rather than a right. Merritt listened without interrupting for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The account, she said. The $814,000 account. Do you have the most recent statement? I have statements for the last 4 years, I said. I can have them on your desk by 9 in the morning. Bring the original deposit documentation as well, she said. The Virginia property liquidation, everything that establishes your grandmother's contribution as primary. I have it, I said. There was a pause. Then Merritt said, Callahan, I want you to understand something about the timeline here. Tell me, what your uncle attempted tonight is not the first move, she said. Based on what you've described, the account restructuring language, the way it was presented to a principal with documented cognitive variability, the specific framing as optimization rather than transfer of authority, this has the signature of a plan that has been in motion for considerably longer than tonight. We are not at the beginning of this. We may be at the end of it. I looked at the streetlight through the windshield. The light had that particular specific quality of late evening in the city, the warm amber of a sodium vapor fixture against a dark sky, the kind of light that makes everything look simultaneously close and very far away. I know, I said. That's why I've been watching for 3 years. Then let's make sure everything you've watched is on the record, Merritt said. I'm going to bring in a forensic financial analyst, someone I've worked with before. He has a specific history with elder financial abuse litigation, and he is very, very good at reconstructing transaction timelines from partial documentation. His name? Warren Kestrel, she said. You'll like him. He doesn't talk very much. I told Merritt I would be at her office at 8:45 in the morning with everything she had asked for. I told her to expect the account statements, the original deposit documentation from the Virginia property liquidation, and a log I had been maintaining for 31 months. A private, date-stamped record of every conversation, every observed behavior, every piece of lateral information I had gathered about Dennis Upton's management of that account, kept in a narrow black notebook with quadrille-ruled pages that I had been filling in a handwriting so small it required a magnifier to review. The notebook was at home, in a fireproof lockbox. Behind a secondary lock whose combination existed only in my memory, I had been very careful about the notebook. Merritt said goodnight. I started the car. The drive home was longer this time, not because of traffic, but because I took a route that added 8 minutes and passed through the older part of the city. The part with the wide, tree-lined streets and the houses that have been there long enough to have settled into their own foundations. And I needed those 8 minutes the way you sometimes need the physical movement of travel to allow the events of an evening to finish arranging themselves into their correct operational categories. My father had called me a failure at his own dinner table, in front of his wife and his son, and his brother and his grandmother. The woman who had entrusted nearly $500,000 of a life's work to a joint account that was now in the process of being quietly redirected. He had called me a failure. He had spent 48 years constructing a version of me built entirely from assumption, and the specific, reflexive diminishment of a man who has never been able to tolerate the presence of someone he cannot accurately measure. What he did not know, sitting at the head of that table with his sister in law's teal dress, and his brother's cream colored folder and his wife's good china, and the particular elevated confidence of a man who has just publicly reasserted his dominance over a room, is that the woman who walked out of his front door and into the night was not the woman he had been measuring all these years. She had a 4-year financial log. She had an attorney who answered on the second ring. She had statements, documentation, and the kind of specific, verifiable record that does not require anyone to believe her, because the numbers themselves do the speaking, and numbers have never once needed anyone to defend them. They simply sit on the page and wait. And somewhere in the warm interior of that house, surrounded by good china and braised short rib and the performative warmth of a celebration that had just become something else entirely, Dennis Upton was refilling his wine glass and telling himself that the evening had gone exactly according to plan. Warren Kestrel arrived at Attorney Merritt's office on a Tuesday morning, carrying a soft-sided briefcase in charcoal gray canvas with brass corner reinforcements. The kind of bag that belongs to a man who has been doing precise, methodical work for a very long time and has stopped caring whether his equipment signals ambition. He was 53 years old, lean in the way that people who forget to eat become lean, and he had the particular quality of stillness that I associate with people who have trained themselves to listen before they speak, which is rarer than it should be and considerably more valuable. He set the briefcase on the conference table in Merritt's office. He opened it without preamble. He did not shake my hand first or make the introductory small talk that most people use to establish comfort before delivering difficult information. He simply opened the briefcase and began laying documents on the table in a sequence that told me immediately he had already decided on the narrative architecture of what he was about to present and that the narrative was not going to be simple. For years of statements, he said. You gave me 4 years. I want to talk about what I found in year 1. I folded my hands on the table. Merritt sat to my left with a fresh legal pad and a pen she had not yet uncapped. Kestrel placed a single page in the center of the table. It was a transaction summary, date stamped from 49 months prior, and the first line item was a withdrawal of $62,000.00 from the joint investment account held between my father, registered as co-signatory, and my grandmother, Evelyn Marsh, registered as primary contributor and account originator. This withdrawal, Kestrel said, tapping the line with one finger, bears your grandmother's signature on the authorization form. He placed a second document beside the first. This is your grandmother's signature from a lease agreement she signed the same month. He placed a third document. This is her signature from a pharmacy consent form dated 11 days after the withdrawal. He let me look at all three for approximately 40 seconds. The withdrawal signature, he said, shares the correct general letter form with her actual signature. The proportions are approximately correct, but the pressure distribution is wrong. Your grandmother writes with a consistent left-to-right pressure increase, meaning her strokes become slightly heavier as the pen moves across the page. The withdrawal signature shows uniform pressure throughout, which is characteristic of someone copying a form rather than producing it from muscle memory. Merritt uncapped her pen. That is a copied signature, I said. That is my professional opinion, Kestrel said, which I am prepared to support with a full forensic document analysis prepared for court submission. He paused. That is the first withdrawal. I found 7 more. He laid them out in sequence across the table, 8 transaction summaries, covering a period of 31 months, each bearing my grandmother's authorization signature, each analyzed in a separate annotation sheet that Kestrel had prepared with the meticulous, cross-reference density of a man who understands that the value of evidence is in its layering. The total across all 8 withdrawals was $418,000 and no cents. I want you to hold that number. $418,000 and no cents, removed from an account whose primary contribution had been $450,000, the proceeds of my grandmother's coastal Virginia property, a house her late husband had built with a combination of contractor labor and his own hands over the course of 3 years before I was born. A house she had lived in for 31 years before selling it 14 years ago, and entrusting its value to what she had been told, was a carefully managed joint investment structure that would grow and protect that capital for the remainder of her life. She had, as of the most recent statement, approximately $814,000 in the account because the market performance of the underlying investments had, over 14 years, more than compensated for the withdrawals. This is the specific, cruel geometry of long running financial, fraud, and elder accounts. The account can grow in absolute value while being systematically drained, and the victim, reviewing a statement that shows a larger number than the one they remember, is unlikely to register the discrepancy between what should be there and what is. My grandmother had been reviewing statements that showed growth. She had not been reviewing statements that showed her what the account would have held if the 8 withdrawals had never occurred. Kestrel placed a final document on the table. It was a single-page summary he had prepared himself, clean and precisely formatted, showing the actual account balance, the reconstructed account balance absent the unauthorized withdrawals, and the difference between them. The difference was $418,000 and no cents. Where did it go? Merritt asked. Kestrel opened a second section of the briefcase. 3 separate destination accounts, he said. The first 2 are held in the name of a limited liability company registered in Delaware, incorporated 11 years and 3 months ago, whose registered agent is a legal services firm that Dennis Upton has used for 3 other business registrations. He placed the corporate registration documents on the table. The company's name is Greenfeld Capital Advisors, Limited Liability Company. It has no website. It has no employees on record with the state labor registry. It has no client accounts other than the ones receiving transfers from your grandmother's investment account. A shell, I said. A shell, Kestrel confirmed. The third destination account is more interesting. He placed a bank statement on the table. It is a personal checking account held at a regional bank in the name of Renata Upton. The room was quiet for a moment. I did not react. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger and registered the information with the flat, clinical attention of someone who had suspected the destination, but needed the confirmation of a documented trail. How much to Renata directly? Merritt asked. $87,040 across 9 transfers, Kestrel said, each transfer structured to fall below the $10,000 federal reporting threshold, which means the structuring itself constitutes an additional violation under federal banking law, specifically the Bank Secrecy Act. Merritt was writing quickly. There is one more element, Kestrel said. He placed a document I had not expected. It was a loan agreement, dated 22 months prior, bearing both my father's signature and my grandmother's, showing a personal loan from the joint investment account to my father in the amount of $122,000 and no cents, structured as a 5-year interest-bearing loan with monthly repayment terms. How many repayments have been made? I asked. 0, Kestrel said, not one. My father had borrowed $122,000 from my grandmother's retirement account and had not made a single repayment in 22 months. I looked at the loan agreement for a long time. Not because I needed the time to process the information, but because I wanted to record the specific, physical reality of that document in my memory with complete precision. The weight of the paper, the typeface used for the principal amount, the signature at the bottom in my father's particular forward-leaning hand, the signature I had watched him produce on birthday cards and permission slips, and the inside covers of books he gave as gifts throughout my entire childhood. The loan agreement, I said, was my grandmother's signature on this one also copied? Kestrel looked at me steadily. Her signature on this document is genuine, he said. She signed this one herself, which means she knew about this loan. She knew about this loan, Kestrel said. What she may not have known, depending on how it was presented to her, is that no repayments were ever made, and that the loan agreement contained a clause in paragraph 4, subsection 3, stating that in the event of default, the outstanding principal would be converted to a gift under the terms of the account's existing gifting provisions. I looked at paragraph 4, subsection 3. My father had borrowed $122,000 from my grandmother's account, built in a default to gift clause, and then simply stopped making payments. The loan had converted itself, by its own design, into a gift that my grandmother had not knowingly authorized. Who drafted this agreement? Merritt asked. The same legal services firm that registered the Delaware Limited Liability Company, Kestrel said. I sat back in my chair. I did not say anything for approximately 30 seconds. I was performing, in that silence, the specific mental exercise I have used since early in my military career when presented with a situation whose full scope has just become clear. I was cataloging every piece of information, every document on the table, every figure in Kestrel's annotations, and I was constructing, in the architectural space of my own thinking, the precise sequence in which these pieces would need to be deployed to produce the outcome I required. The outcome was not destruction for its own sake. I want to be specific about that. The outcome was the restoration of my grandmother's account to its reconstructed balance, the protection of her remaining assets from the account restructuring Dennis had attempted at the dinner table, and the formal, legal, documented accountability of every person whose name appeared on those transaction records. My father, Dennis, Renata, all three. What is our timeline? I asked Merritt. The forensic analysis needs to be completed and certified before we can file, she said. Warren, how long? 3 weeks for the full report, Kestrel said. 2 if you need it. 3 is fine, I said. I have something that requires approximately 4 weeks of setup on my end. Merritt looked at me. What are you planning? I picked up my clutch from the table. The cognac leather, the brass clasp, I set it back down. Nothing yet, I said. Right now I'm going to go be invisible for a while. Renata called me on a Thursday, 12 days after the dinner. I want to describe the quality of that call with the precision it deserves, because it is representative of the entire category of contact I received over the following 3 weeks. A sustained, ambient campaign of social pressure delivered through the medium of family normalcy. Each communication constructed to feel casual and unremarkable while carrying, underneath its surface, a very specific set of messages about where I stood and what was expected of me. Renata opened the call with the particular warmth she uses as an approach vector, asking how I was, whether I had been resting, whether the drive home from the dinner had been all right. 3 minutes of surface temperature before she reached her actual purpose. Your father and I were hoping, she said, and I noticed the pronoun, the way she had absorbed herself into my father's household through the possessive, that you might come to a clearer understanding of the account situation. Dennis has explained everything to your grandmother's satisfaction. A pause, calibrated for impact. Evelyn is on board. She signed the preliminary paperwork last week. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence do what silence does in these situations, which is to generate, in the person who has just delivered information they expect to be provocative, a faint but measurable anxiety about whether the information has landed. I appreciate you letting me know, I said. Renata's voice adjusted fractionally. She had expected something with more resistance. Resistance is the thing she is equipped to manage. Compliance produces a different kind of problem for her, because it removes the friction against which her tactical energy is designed to push. We just want this to be something the whole family is comfortable with, she said. Of course, I said. Everything Renata said on that call, I wrote down in the narrow black notebook with quadrille-ruled pages within 7 minutes of hanging up. Date, time, duration of call, and a verbatim reconstruction of every specific claim she made, including the claim that my grandmother had signed the preliminary paperwork. I flagged that entry with a small mark in the upper right corner of the page, which is the notation I use for items that require cross-referencing with Merritt. I called Merritt that evening. I told her about the preliminary paperwork. If she signed under conditions of misrepresentation, Merritt said, the signature is voidable. I want to know what she was told before she signed. Can you talk to her directly? Saturday, I said. I have lunch with her Saturday. My grandmother and I have had a standing Saturday lunch for the last 2 years, a habit that developed quietly and without announcement, the kind of recurring appointment that exists between two people who have decided, independently and then jointly, that the relationship is worth protecting. We meet at a restaurant she has favored for approximately 15 years, a small Italian place with red-checked tablecloths and a corner table that the staff holds for her without needing to be asked. I did not discuss the account at that lunch. I want to be clear about this, because it is a distinction that matters legally and also to me personally. I did not use that lunch to conduct any form of investigation or to solicit any information that could be characterized as obtained through pressure or influence. I simply had lunch with my grandmother, and I listened to her, the way I always listened to her, with the complete, present attention that I consider one of the few pure forms of respect available to one person from another. She told me about a book she had been reading. She told me about a cardinal that had been coming to the feeder outside her kitchen window every morning for 3 weeks. She told me that she had been thinking about her husband, my grandfather, more than usual lately, in the way that sometimes happens in the spring when the light has a particular quality that she associates with the years of their early marriage. Near the end of the lunch, with the tone of a woman who has been carrying something and has decided to set it down, she said, "Dennis brought more papers last week." I picked up my water glass. "Did you review them before you signed?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "He told me it was a formality," she said. "He told me my attorney had already approved the structure." "Which attorney?" I asked. She named a firm I did not recognize. I wrote the name in my notebook that evening, with the same small flag in the upper right corner. My brother Garrett texted me on the following Monday. The text was brief and carried the compressed, uncomfortable energy of a message composed by someone who has been asked to send it by someone else. "Dad says you've been making things difficult. Just let this go, Cal, it's not worth it." I looked at that text for a long time. I thought about Garrett, who is 34 years old and works in insurance, and has spent his entire adult life maintaining his position in the family by the specific strategy of never being the person who makes things difficult. I do not hold this against him in any categorical way. The architecture of our family is such that the path of least resistance runs directly through agreement with our father, and Garrett discovered this early and has navigated accordingly. But the text told me something useful, which is that my father had registered my silence not as submission but as a strategic withdrawal, and that he was now attempting to use my brother as a proxy pressure mechanism. I texted back 3 words. "I hear you." That was all. Dennis called 4 days later. His call had a different quality from Renata's: less performative warmth, more structural confidence. The call of a man who believes the transaction he is completing is effectively done and that the remaining conversations are administrative rather than contested. He told me that the account restructuring was nearly finalized. He told me that the new structure would be simpler for everyone. He told me that he had always been protective of my grandmother's interests, that the family's collective judgment was the best protection she had, and that outside interference, and he did not specify what he meant by outside interference, but the meaning was unmistakable, would only create unnecessary complexity. "I want what's best for her," I said. "We all do," Dennis said, and his voice had the absolute, settled confidence of a man who has never once considered that the person he is speaking to might be several moves ahead of him on a board he does not know he is playing. I thanked him for calling. I ended the call and immediately added it to the log, full verbatim reconstruction, timestamp, duration, and a notation at the bottom that read, "Subject confirmed awareness of ongoing restructuring process, characterized opposition as outside interference, demonstrated no awareness of forensic review currently underway." My father called once. Just once in the entire 4 weeks between the dinner and what was coming. He called on a Sunday evening, and the call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and it was, in its way, the most revealing communication I received during that entire period, not because of what he said, but because of the specific, particular quality of what he did not say. He did not apologize for the dinner table. He did not acknowledge General Fowler or the ballroom or the 15 years of silence that he had never once thought to break by asking a question. He called me on a Sunday evening with the tone of a man performing a duty, checking a box, satisfying himself that he had made the appropriate gesture toward family cohesion, and he said, in the voice he uses when he has decided something is settled, "I hope you're doing all right, Callahan. These family things can be complicated." I did not scream. I did not produce any of the sounds that a woman who has been publicly called a failure twice in the span of 10 days by her own father would be expected to produce. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger, felt the specific, grounding point of pressure, and noted with the flat attention of clinical observation that my father's version of reconciliation is entirely indistinguishable from his version of dismissal. "I'm doing well," I said. "Thank you for calling." He seemed satisfied with that. Every one of these calls, every text, every secondhand relay through Garrett, every carefully worded communication from Renata, I had recorded, reconstructed, dated, and logged. The notebook was now 63 pages in handwriting so small it required the magnifier to review, and the log it contained was a documented, chronological record of a family that had spent 4 weeks building a case against itself out of the raw material of its own arrogance. 3 days before the event, I drove to Dominique's apartment. She lives on the 6th floor of a building in the east part of the city, in an apartment that looks, from the outside, exactly like every other apartment on that floor, and looks from the inside like the workspace of a woman who has spent 20 years developing a specific, practical competence that she has never felt the need to advertise. The walls are largely bare except for two framed topographic maps and a whiteboard covered in a system of notation that would be illegible to most people and is immediately clear to me. The desk is a solid core door on two filing cabinets, which is the furniture choice of someone who prioritized surface area over aesthetics, and the surface was, on the evening I arrived, covered in the specific, organized density of a project in its final assembly phase. I want to tell you about Dominique Harwell with the accuracy she deserves. She spent 11 years in military intelligence, not in the field, but in the specific analytical discipline of information architecture, meaning she spent 11 years learning how to take fragmented, partial, laterally gathered intelligence and organize it into structures that are complete, coherent, and defensible under scrutiny. When she left the service, she took that competence into the private sector, and she now operates as an independent information security consultant, which means, in practical terms, that she understands how digital footprints are created, how they are preserved, how they are legally obtained, and how they are presented in formats that courts and regulatory bodies find credible. She is the reason my evidence file is not just a personal notebook. On the desk, arranged in the sequence she had established over the preceding 2 weeks, were 14 manila envelopes. Each one was sealed with a strip of white evidence tape, initialed in her handwriting at the overlap, and labeled on the front face with a category identifier in the black marker she uses for archival work. The envelopes were standard legal size, buff-colored, the kind with the metal clasp at the top and the string closure wound around a reinforced paper disc, and the specific physical weight of them, distributed across the desk surface in their careful sequence, had the particular quality of assembled, organized proof, the weight of things that are finished being gathered and are ready to be used. I set my briefcase on the floor beside the desk and sat in the chair she had positioned for me. Walk me through it, I said. Dominique picked up the first envelope. Transaction records, she said. Kestrel's forensic analysis, certified and notarized with the signature comparison exhibits for all 8 unauthorized withdrawals. Original documentation, copies for court filing, copies for the regulatory submission. She set it down and picked up the second. Corporate registration records, Greenfeld Capital Advisors, Limited Liability Company. Delaware Incorporation, registered agent correspondence, the bank account records showing the transfer pathway from your grandmother's investment account to the shell company's accounts. She set it down. Third envelope. Renata Upton's personal checking account statements, subpoenaed through Merritt's office, showing the $87,000.40 across 9 structured transfers. She moved through the envelopes with the systematic, unhurried pace of someone who has organized evidence before, who knows that the quality of the organization is itself a form of argument, that a well-structured evidence file communicates competence and intentionality to everyone who receives it, from the regulatory examiner to the judge. Seventh envelope. Your notebook, she said. The original, plus my full digital transcription, indexed by date, cross-referenced with call logs and text message records, time-stamped and authenticated. She placed it on the desk with a precision that felt like ceremony. The call logs are the ones I want to talk about. She opened a laptop to the right of the envelope array. On the screen was a document that she had constructed over the preceding 3 weeks, using the call detail records that Merritt had obtained through the legal process, and the additional metadata that Dominique had extracted through the methods available to someone with her background and credentials. Every call I had received, every text, was represented in the document as an entry with a timestamp, a duration, a geolocation marker for the originating device where available, and a cross-reference to the corresponding entry in the notebook transcription. The dentist called from 11 days ago, she said, scrolling to the entry. He called from his personal cell. The cell's carrier data shows him at a location that cross-references with the address of the legal services firm that registered the Delaware Limited Liability Company. He was at their office when he called you. I looked at the geolocation marker, the timestamp, the duration. He was coordinating the call with the attorneys while the restructuring was in active progress, I said. While he was telling you it was nearly finalized, Dominique said, meaning the finalization was occurring in the same physical location from which the call originated. She paused. That is not exculpatory information for Dennis. I pulled the notebook from my briefcase, the narrow black quadrille-ruled notebook, 63 pages of compressed, precise documentation, and I placed it on the desk beside the seventh envelope. Dominique photographed it against a white background, front and back cover, then each page in sequence, using a camera mounted on a small desktop stand that she had configured for archival document photography, with consistent lighting and a resolution high enough to capture the individual pressure variations of my handwriting. The photographs were timestamped automatically and backed up to three separate encrypted locations in real time. Internet Protocol Tracking Logs, she said, moving to the ninth envelope. Your family members accessed three separate documents that I seeded into a cloud storage account 6 weeks ago. The documents appeared from their file names and metadata to be estate planning materials related to your grandmother's assets. They were not. They were tracking documents, each embedded with a unique pixel that registered every access event, including the device identifier, the Internet Protocol address, the geographic location, and the timestamp. I looked at the access log she had printed and included in the envelope. Dennis had accessed all three documents. Renata had accessed two. My father had accessed one. They were reviewing documents they had no authorization to access, I said. Documents they believed were private estate materials belonging to your grandmother, Dominique said. Documents they accessed without her knowledge or authorization. That is unauthorized access to protected digital information under federal statute. She paused. Merritt knows about these logs. She has reviewed them and confirmed their admissibility under the methods by which they were obtained. The 14th envelope contained what Dominique called the timeline brief, a single document, 42 pages, that she and I had worked on together over the preceding 2 weeks, compiling every piece of evidence into a single, coherent, chronologically organized narrative of the fraud, from its first documented instance 49 months ago to the dinner table presentation of the restructuring documents 9 days prior. The brief was written in plain, accessible language, the kind of language that a regulatory examiner or a judge's clerk can review without specialized financial knowledge, but it cited, at every relevant point, the specific documentary evidence that supported each claim. It was, in short, a complete case. Not the kind of case that requires someone to believe the protagonist. The kind of case that requires only that the reader look at the documents in the order in which they are presented. I held the 14th envelope in both hands for a moment, feeling the specific, substantial weight of 42 pages of assembled, organized truth. And I thought about the $814,000 account statement my grandmother had most recently reviewed, the number that looked like growth but represented, in its gap from the reconstructed balance, $418,000 of her late husband's labor and her own life's equity. Moved in the dark through a shell company and a complicit spouse's checking account, and a loan designed to become a gift. I set the envelope down carefully. The submission package, I said. Is it ready? It goes out tomorrow morning, Dominique said. Merit files with the court first. The regulatory submissions go out simultaneously. The Adult Protective Services referral goes through a separate channel 45 minutes after the court filing, so the timing is sequential but not dependent. And the other submission? I said. Dominique looked at me with the particular, direct attention she uses when she wants me to know she has not overlooked anything. The detailed summary letter, with the evidence index attached, goes to General Fowler's office at 8 in the morning, she said. He reached out to Merritt last week after the ballroom. He wanted to know if there was anything he should be aware of. Apparently, your father has been telling people in his former professional network that the retirement party incident was a misunderstanding. I thought about my father at the podium with his crystal lowball glass and his amber drink, the glass that had cost $247.83 from his department's gift registry, the glass whose grip had loosened, by a fraction, when the institutional weight of my record landed in the room. I thought about the cream-colored press packet in my cognac leather clutch, the retirement biography in which my name appeared exactly 0 times, the document I had folded and kept not out of sentiment, but out of the settled certainty that the most lethal documents are the ones people believe no one has bothered to keep. Is there anything else? I asked. Dominique closed the laptop. She aligned the 14 envelopes into a precise, even stack at the center of the desk, and she placed both hands flat on top of them, a gesture that was not dramatic but was, in its quiet solidity, the physical language of completion. No, she said, there's nothing else, it's done. I drove home through the city at 11:40 at night, and the streets had that particular, specific quality of a city after 10, the amber sodium vapor light against dark pavement, the absence of foot traffic, the clean, minimal geometry of a landscape that has been stripped of its daytime performance and shows only its structural reality. I parked in front of my building and I sat in the car for a moment, not to compose myself, because there was nothing in me that required composition, but because I wanted to be still for a moment in the space between what I had assembled and what was about to be released into the world. My father was, at that hour, in all likelihood asleep in the house with the split rail fence painted weathered gray, satisfied with the management of a situation he believed he had effectively closed. Dennis was, in all likelihood, in communication with the attorneys who had helped him structure a fraud across 49 months, reviewing the finalization timeline of an account restructuring that he believed was now within his control. Renata was, in all likelihood, reviewing the balance of the checking account that had received $87,000.40 in 9 structured transfers, a number that was about to become the most documented figure in a federal banking violation complaint. None of them knew that the evidence package was assembled and waiting in 14 stamped manila envelopes on Dominique Harwell's desk. None of them knew that the forensic financial analysis was certified and notarized and cross referenced with documentary proof that would not require anyone to believe a woman who had been called a failure at her father's retirement party and again at his dinner table. None of them knew that in 12 hours, the submissions would go out, and the machinery of institutional accountability would begin moving with the slow, absolute, unstoppable momentum of a thing that does not require permission from the people it is coming for. My father would wake up tomorrow morning believing he had successfully managed a complicated family situation, and that was the precise, specific, particular quality of dramatic irony that I had spent 15 years in silence quietly building toward, because there is no reckoning quite as complete as the one that arrives while its target is still congratulating himself on his own victory. Tomorrow, the machine would move, and my father would be having his morning coffee. The invitation arrived by email, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously my father's professional network took the event. A retirement commemoration luncheon, hosted by the Federal Contracting Firms Regional Alumni Association, held in the private dining room of the Harrington Club, which is a members only establishment in the older part of the financial district, with dark wood paneling and portraits of men who made decisions, and a reputation for the kind of discretion that serious people consider a feature rather than an amenity. 112 guests confirmed. Seated luncheon. Remarks by the outgoing regional director, followed by a presentation to my father of a formal citation of service. General Fowler would be in attendance. My father had circulated the invitation himself, which I knew because the email chain it arrived on contained 3 messages back in the thread, his original forwarding note to a distribution list that included, through the same administrative accident that had once sent me the gift registry for the crystal lowball glass set, my personal email address. I had been on his distribution list for 2 years without his knowledge. I want to be precise about my state of mind in the 72 hours before that luncheon. People who hear this story later tend to project onto that period a quality of nervous anticipation, the tightened, electric feeling of someone waiting for a bomb they have set to detonate. That is not an accurate description. What I experienced in those 72 hours was the particular, settled calm of a woman who has done the preparation and is now simply waiting for the appointed time. The way a surgeon is calm before an operation, not because the operation is insignificant, but because the preparation has been thorough, and the outcome is, to the extent that any outcome can be, determined. I had my suit dry cleaned and pressed. I had a specific meal at a restaurant I like on the Thursday evening, alone, with a book I had been meaning to finish for 3 months. I slept 8 hours on both nights. I called my grandmother on the Friday morning, and we talked for 23 minutes about the cardinal that was still coming to her feeder, and whether it might be the same one from the previous year, and she laughed in the way she laughs when something genuinely delights her, which is one of the sounds I am most committed to protecting. I did not tell her what was coming. She would find out through Merritt, in a private, careful, fully supported conversation that had already been scheduled for the Monday following the luncheon. Everything about the process of informing my grandmother had been designed to ensure that she received the information in conditions of maximum support and minimum shock, because she is 81 years old and she is the person who was actually harmed, and her experience of this reckoning was not going to be collateral to mine. Saturday morning. The Harrington Club. I arrived at 11:47, which was 13 minutes before the stated start time, because I wanted to be seated and composed when the room filled rather than entering into an already assembled space. The private dining room was arranged with round tables of 10, each set with the particular formality of an institution that still uses linen napkins, folded into standing peaks and individual salt cellars, and water poured from pitchers rather than bottles. The lighting was warm and low, the kind of lighting that makes everyone in the room look considered and important, which is precisely its function. Dominique was already there. She was seated at a table in the northeastern quadrant of the room, 3 tables from the presentation dais, wearing a charcoal blazer and the expression of a woman attending a professional luncheon, which is to say, she looked entirely unremarkable and entirely correct, which is its own form of precision. She did not look at me when I entered. We had agreed not to perform any visible connection until the appropriate moment. I found my seat. My name was on a place card in the standard serif typeface used for all the place cards at the table, which told me I had been assigned my seat through the general registration process rather than specifically positioned by my father, meaning he did not know I was coming. I placed my cognac leather clutch on the table to the left of my place setting, brass clasp facing outward, and I sat down and accepted a glass of water from the server and I waited. My father arrived at 11:58 with my mother on his arm and Dennis, and Renata 2 steps behind. The specific, practiced formation of a family unit performing its public version of itself. He was wearing a dark suit with a pocket square in a warm cream color that matched my mother's blouse, which told me my mother had coordinated their appearance, which she always does for events she considers significant. He moved through the room with the elevated, expansive energy of a man who knows this occasion is for him and has been anticipating the authority of that for weeks. He did not see me immediately. Dennis saw me first. I watched his stride break by half a step, the almost imperceptible interruption of a man whose body has registered something his mind has not yet finished processing. He recovered within 2 seconds, which is actually a fairly fast recovery, and his face rearranged itself into the expression he uses for people he has decided are manageable. He leaned toward Renata and said something brief, and her chin lifted by a fraction in the particular way it does when she is recalibrating. My father found me approximately 30 seconds after Dennis did. His expression did not collapse. He is, whatever else he is, a man with a long history of performance in public rooms, and the performance instinct is fast and deep in him. But I saw, in the 2 second window between recognition and recovery, the specific, involuntary adjustment of a man whose body has just understood something that his constructed narrative had been refusing to accommodate. He crossed the room toward me with the determined, forward leaning energy of a man who has decided to manage the situation by naming it. Callahan, he said, I wasn't aware you were attending. I received the invitation, I said. I assumed it was intentional. A pause, one beat. The pause of a man recalibrating without the resources to do so invisibly. Of course, he said. Of course, good, it's good that you're here. He moved to his table. I watched him go and I noticed, without particular satisfaction but with complete precision, that his left hand had found his jacket pocket in the gesture he uses when his hands need somewhere to be that is not visible to the room. The luncheon proceeded. The regional director spoke for 11 minutes about my father's 39 years of service to the firm, covering largely the same narrative I had reviewed in the press packet at the retirement party, the cream-colored folder I had folded in half and placed in this very clutch, which was now sitting on this table in this room. My father received the remarks with the gracious, slightly overwhelmed performance of a man accepting tribute he has been expecting. Then the presentation of the formal citation. The regional director read the citation in full, a 12-sentence document that summarized my father's contributions to the firm's regional expansion, his mentorship of junior colleagues, his professional integrity over 4 decades of service. Then he invited my father to say a few words. My father stood. He accepted the microphone with the ease of a man who has been holding microphones at events like this his entire adult life. He thanked the director. He thanked his colleagues. He thanked my mother, which produced a warm, collective response from the room. He made a brief practice joke about fishing that landed the expected laugh. Then he looked out over the assembled room, and I watched him find General Fowler at a table to his left, and I watched some calculation occur behind his eyes, and then he looked toward me, and I understood in that moment, with the flat, accurate clarity of 15 years of studying this particular man, what he was about to do. He was going to do it again. Was going to use this room, this audience, this occasion, as the platform for one final public reassertion of the narrative he had been constructing about me for 38 years. He had done it at the ballroom in front of 200 people, and it had partially misfired, and instead of registering that misfire as information, he had processed it as a technical error rather than a structural one. He had decided the problem was the proximity of General Fowler, not the content of his assessment. And now he was going to try again, in a room where he believed he had recalibrated the variables in his favor. Family, he said with the expansive, generous tone of a man performing affection for an audience, is the foundation of everything. My wife has been my anchor for 41 years. Warm response from the room. My son Garrett is a young man I am genuinely proud of. He paused. The pause was timed. I recognized the timing because I had heard it before, in the ballroom, 3 seconds before his arm swung toward me. And then there are the complicated ones. A ripple of anticipatory laughter from people who had been at the retirement party and recognized the setup. Callahan, my daughter. He found me again in the room. 15 years of silence, not one holiday, not one phone call she didn't have to be prompted for. He let that land. A daughter who couldn't manage to build a career or a family or anything that looks like a life. He spread his hands in a gesture of theatrical, resigned acceptance. I've made my peace with it. A man learns to accept what his children are capable of. The room had the quality of a space in which people are laughing with insufficient information. General Fowler was not laughing. I did not stand immediately. I picked up my water glass with my right hand, took one measured sip, and set it down with the complete architectural calm of a woman who has been waiting for precisely this sentence in precisely this room. And then I reached into my cognac leather clutch, opened the brass clasp, and removed the cream-colored press packet that I had placed there at the retirement party, and carried forward through every subsequent event as the specific physical document I intended to use in this specific physical moment. I stood. I wonder, I said, and my voice carried the way voices carry in rooms with good acoustics and a sudden, attentive silence, if I might say something. My father's expression registered the standing, registered the press packet in my hand, registered something he could not yet fully identify, but whose shape his body understood before his mind did, because the crystal lowball glass on the table in front of him shifted fractionally when his hand contacted it. The same involuntary, fractional tilt I had watched at the retirement party. The same adjustment of grip that advertises the pressure behind it. This is a beautiful document, I said, holding the press packet up so the room could see it. A formal account of 39 years of professional service. 3 pages, single-spaced. I opened it. My name does not appear in it once. The room was listening with the complete, focused attention of people who understand they are in the middle of something that is no longer a prepared program. My name is Major Callahan Reeves Upton, I said. I have been on active duty for 15 years. I have served in 3 separate deployment theaters. I have received the Distinguished Service Medal, which General Fowler was kind enough to describe at my father's retirement party 2 months ago. I looked at General Fowler. He gave a brief, confirming nod. I looked back at the room. My father has described me this morning as someone who could not build a career. I want to address that description with some specificity. I set the press packet on the table. I opened my clutch again and removed the second item, the document I had added to the clutch the morning of this luncheon, a copy of my most recent official service record summary, 4 pages, certified by the Department of the Army, which Merritt had obtained through proper channels 3 weeks prior, and which I had been carrying in the clutch since 8 in the morning for precisely this reason. I placed it on the table in front of me. This is my service record, I said. It is a public document. Anyone in this room is welcome to review it. It describes with institutional precision exactly what kind of career I built in the 15 years my father spent believing I had failed. Dennis was sitting very still. Renata's hand was on the table, not holding anything, just flat against the linen, which is the posture of a woman whose hands do not know where to be. I reached into the clutch a third time. The notebook. The narrow black quadrille-ruled notebook, 63 pages, handwriting so small it requires a magnifier. I placed it on the table beside the service record. This, I said, is a log I have been keeping for 31 months. It documents, with dates and times and verbatim reconstructions, every communication I received from members of my immediate family regarding a joint investment account held between my father and my maternal grandmother, Evelyn Marsh. I let the name land. The account was funded primarily by my grandmother, with an original deposit of $450,000, proceeds from the sale of a property in coastal Virginia. Over the past 49 months, 8 unauthorized withdrawals totaling $418,000, and no cents were made from that account, each bearing a signature that a certified forensic document analyst has determined, in a report currently filed with the court, to be a copied rather than genuine authorization. The room had a quality I do not have a precise word for. It was not silence exactly. It was the suspension of ambient sound, the collective, involuntary stillness of 112 people who have just understood that the event they are attending has become something else. My father's face had done something I had never seen it do before. not the collapsed, unmade expression from the retirement party, which was the expression of a man surprised. This was the expression of a man who has understood, with complete and final clarity, that the situation he believed he was managing has been, for a very long time, managing him. That's completely false, Dennis said. His voice was too fast. When a man who normally leads with deliberate, measured confidence produces a response that arrives before the sentence it is responding to has finished landing in the room, the speed itself is the tell. That's a completely false and irresponsible characterization of a family financial matter, and I will not sit here and. The forensic report, I said, without inflection, without any adjustment in the level or temperature of my voice, is filed. The regulatory submission to the relevant federal financial oversight body is filed. The referral to Adult Protective Services regarding the management of a cognitively vulnerable elder's financial assets is filed. I paused. The submissions went out 6 days ago. I am not presenting a characterization. I am describing what is already on the record. Dennis opened his mouth. He closed it. Renata said, "You had no right," and then stopped, because the sentence she had started had no ending that did not make things worse. "The loan agreement," I said, and I watched my father's left hand move against the crystal lowball glass again, the glass that had cost $247.83 from the department gift registry, the glass that had been in his hand at the retirement party and was now in his hand at this table, the specific engraved compass rose crystal that he carried like a scepter, was drafted by the same legal services firm that incorporated the Delaware Shell Company, used to receive unauthorized transfers from my grandmother's account. The loan was for $122,000 and no cents. It contained a default to gift clause. 0 repayments have been made in 22 months. My father said nothing. This is the specific, particular quality of that moment that I want to register with complete accuracy. My father, the man who has held the microphone at every family event for 38 years, the man who roasted me at his own retirement party in front of 200 people, the man who called me a failure at his dinner table in front of his family, and his brother and his sister-in-law, the man who had just 7 minutes ago stood at this podium and told 112 people that I had not built anything that looked like a life, said absolutely nothing. The silence was the victory. General Fowler stood. He did not take the microphone. He did not need it. He simply stood, and the quality of his standing, the specific 4-star weight of it, reorganized the room's attention without requiring a single word. "I believe," he said, in the measured, resonant voice of a man who has ended larger situations than this one, "that this luncheon has concluded its formal program." He looked at the regional director. "I would suggest the room be given a moment." He looked at my father with the expression of a man who has been deceived about the nature of a situation and has made a private, complete, and final assessment of that deception. "We will speak later." He sat down. The room began to move. The fallout did not announce itself with the dramatic, cinematic force that people expect when they imagine accountability arriving for a family like mine. It arrived the way structural damage arrives after a foundation failure. Not all at once, not with noise, but with the quiet, incremental, unstoppable progression of a thing whose physics have been determined and cannot be reversed. The calls to my father's attorney began before he had left the Harrington Club. I know this because Merritt told me, in the measured, unsurprised tone of a woman who has watched this sequence occur in other configurations, that the opposing legal team had made contact within 40 minutes of the luncheon's dissolution. The tone of that initial contact, she said, was not combative. It was the tone of attorneys who have reviewed the filed documentation and have understood that the posture of their client's best interest is no longer defense but damage limitation. Within 72 hours, the picture was as follows. The forensic financial analysis, combined with the bank records Merritt had obtained through the court, had produced sufficient documented evidence for the regulatory body's examination unit to open a formal investigation into the management of the joint investment account. This was not a preliminary inquiry. This was a formal, designated investigation with a case number and assigned examiners, which has a specific meaning in the regulatory context, which is that the institution has reviewed the submitted evidence and determined it meets the threshold for serious concern. Dennis's Delaware Limited Liability Company, Greenfeld Capital Advisors, was placed under a regulatory hold, which meant that no assets held in its accounts could be transferred, withdrawn, or restructured pending the outcome of the investigation. The accounts held approximately $209,000 and no sense of the transferred funds, partially depleted through disbursements that Kestrel's analysis had tracked and documented. Renata's personal checking account was similarly restricted under the banking violation inquiry related to the structured transfers. My father received a formal notice of the investigation, naming him as a co-signatory with knowledge of or responsibility for the account activity under review. The loan agreement, the $122,000 instrument with the default to gift clause drafted by the shell company's legal services firm, was identified in Merit's filing as a potentially fraudulent instrument, and the legal services firm received its own regulatory correspondence within the week. Dennis called me on the Tuesday. He did not open the call with warmth. He did not use the comfortable, territorial familiarity he had employed at the family dinner. His voice had the compressed, tight quality of a man who has spent 48 hours in contact with attorneys and regulators and has arrived at a new and thoroughly unwelcome understanding of his position. "Callahan," he said, "I think we can work this out as a family." I did not respond immediately. I let the sentence exist in the space between us for a moment, the specific, illuminating sentence of a man who had spent weeks telling me that a matter affecting my grandmother's life savings was none of my concern, who had used the word family as a tool of exclusion when it suited him, who was now reaching for the same word as a tool of appeal. "This is no longer a family matter, Dennis," I said. "It is a legal matter. Please direct all future communication to Attorney Merritt's office." I ended the call, Renata texted. The text was 4 messages long and covered, in sequence, a defense of her character, an appeal to our shared family history, a suggestion that I was misunderstanding the nature of the account management, and a final line that read, "We always considered you one of us, Cal. Please remember that." I reviewed the text once. I forwarded it to Merritt. I did not respond. My father called on the Wednesday evening. I answered because there was one thing I needed to hear from him directly, one specific thing, and I needed to hear it in his voice rather than relayed through anyone else. He said, "Callahan, this is going to destroy us." I sat with that sentence for a moment, the us. The particular, reflexive us of a man who has, throughout my entire life, defined the family unit as a structure that exists to support and protect his own position, and who now, in the moment of its fracture, reaches instinctively for the collective pronoun. "I want you to hear something," I said. He waited. "I did not do this to destroy you," I said. "I did this because my grandmother entrusted $450,000 from the sale of my grandfather's house to an account that was then used to fund your retirement, Dennis's shell company, and Renata's personal spending. And no one in this family thought she would be protected by anyone, because no one in this family thought I was capable of protecting anyone." I paused, one breath. "You told me I was a failure, twice, in public. In rooms full of people. What you were actually doing was telling the room that no one was watching. You were wrong." He said nothing. "Good night," I said. I ended the call and I sat in my car outside my building in the amber sodium vapor light of the city at 9 in the evening, and I felt, for the first time since the retirement party, the complete, settled, unlayered quality of a thing that is finished. The legal process continued for 4 months after the luncheon, with the systematic, institutional momentum of processes that do not require the protagonist's ongoing management once they are set in motion. Merritt handled the filings. Kestrel testified to his forensic analysis. The regulatory examiners completed their review. The outcome was as follows. My grandmother's account was ordered restored to its reconstructed balance, meaning the entities responsible for the unauthorized withdrawals were required to return $418,000 and no cents to the account, through a combination of the restricted funds in Dennis's shell company accounts and a structured repayment arrangement secured against Dennis and Renata's joint assets, which included a house they had purchased 4 years ago with a mortgage whose monthly payment had been. Kestrel discovered, partially funded through one of the shell company's disbursements. My father's loan was declared a fraudulent instrument by the court. The $122,000 and no cents was treated as an unsecured debt to my grandmother's estate, repayable with interest calculated from the date of the first missed payment. The legal services firm lost its operating license in the state. Dennis received a formal civil judgment and a referral for criminal prosecution, which was, as of the time I am telling you this, proceeding through the relevant process. My father did not face criminal charges. He faced the civil judgment as co-signatory, the reputational consequences of a public record that is searchable by anyone who looks for his name, and the specific, private consequence of a conversation with General Fowler that he has never described to me and that I have never asked about. My mother called me once during the 4 months. The call was brief and had the texture of a woman navigating an enormous amount of dissonance with the limited tools she has developed for that purpose. She said she did not understand how things had gotten so far. I told her I hoped she was all right. We did not have an argument. We did not have a reconciliation. We had a 6-minute conversation between two people who are navigating the specific, complicated geography of a relationship that has been shaped by a third party's authority for so long that neither of them is entirely certain what it looks like without that structure. She sent me a Christmas card in December. Standard holiday design. She signed it with her first name only. I understood the gesture completely. 5 months after the Harrington Club luncheon, I am sitting in the kitchen of an apartment in the city, at a table near a window that faces east, with a cup of coffee, the kind I make in a small stovetop pot that produces a result that is too strong for most people and exactly right for me. The morning light is coming in at a low angle, the particular, warm, precise light of early morning in late autumn, the kind of light that makes the surface of the coffee look like something worth noticing. I am going to speak to you directly now. I have been speaking to you directly this entire time, if you have been listening carefully. But I want to be explicit about it for this last section, because what I am about to say is not narrative. It is the thing the narrative was always trying to be about. The first truth is this: silence is not the same as acceptance, and acceptance is not the same as peace. I spent 15 years silent, and people in my family interpreted that silence as confirmation of their assessment of me. They were wrong about what the silence meant, but I want to be honest with you about the cost of it, because I have told you this story with a certain controlled composure that might make the 15 years sound easier than they were. They were not easy. There were years when the silence felt less like strategy and more like suffocation. Years when the specific weight of being known incorrectly, by the people who were supposed to know you best, pressed against the inside of my chest with a regularity that I managed through discipline and work, and the company of people like Dominique who saw me accurately. The silence was a choice, but it was not a free choice. Understand the difference before you decide whether it is the right choice for you. The second truth is this: narcissistic family systems do not maintain themselves through cruelty alone. They maintain themselves through the distribution of conditional belonging, the specific implicit offer that says, if you agree with the central authority's version of reality, you are in. Garrett was in. My mother was in. I was out from a very early age, not because I did anything to deserve exclusion, but because I was constitutionally unable to perform the agreement that the system required. I could not pretend my father's assessments were accurate when they were not. I could not reflect back the version of myself that served his narrative. If you are the person in your family who cannot perform that agreement, I want you to understand that your inability to perform it is not a failure. It is the part of you that is still intact. The third truth is this: documentation is not vengeance. Documentation is protection. The 31 months I spent keeping that notebook were not 31 months of planning someone's destruction. They were 31 months of building a record that would allow an 81-year-old woman to spend the remainder of her life with the financial security she had earned and was being systematically stripped of, while her family performed warmth over the machinery of her exploitation. If you are in a situation where you are being harmed, or where someone you love is being harmed, by people who are using the language of family to make the harm invisible, document it, date it, write it down. Not because you are planning a confrontation, but because the record is the thing that makes the harm real in contexts that require reality to be proven. The fourth truth is this: the people who call you a failure in public are almost always describing a threat, not a fact. My father did not call me a failure because he had evidence that I had failed. He called me a failure because I had, throughout my entire life, refused to be the version of myself that confirmed his authority over my self concept. And that refusal was, to him, a form of defiance that required a public name. When someone uses a public forum to diminish you, pay very close attention to what they are trying to prevent the room from knowing. In my father's case, he was trying to prevent the room from knowing that he had never asked. He had never once, in 15 years, picked up a phone and asked his daughter what her life looked like. The public diminishment was not about me. It was about filling the space where curiosity should have been with a verdict that did not require him to have done the work of knowing me. The fifth truth is the one I want you to carry most carefully. The reckoning, when it came not because I screamed, or cried, or made a scene, or confronted anyone prematurely, or allowed my pain to become a performance that could be dismissed. It came because I was patient. because I understood that the most powerful position in any asymmetric situation is the position of complete information, and that complete information requires time to assemble. The family had assumptions. I had documents. Assumptions are loud and they feel certain and they fill rooms and they get laughs at retirement parties. Documents are quiet. They sit in fireproof lockboxes in handwriting so small they require a magnifier to review. They do not require anyone to believe them. They simply wait. The morning light has moved across the table while I have been sitting here. The way morning light moves when you have been still long enough for the Earth's rotation to become visible in the increments of a shadow's travel across a wooden surface. My coffee is almost finished. The city outside the window is doing what cities do in early morning, assembling itself for another day. The distant sound of traffic, and the particular, specific quality of light that belongs only to this hour and will belong to it again tomorrow and every morning after. My grandmother's account was fully restored 6 weeks ago. I spoke with her on the phone the evening Merritt confirmed the final transfer, and she was quiet for a moment after I told her the number, the full, reconstructed balance, and then she said, in the voice she uses when she has understood something completely and does not need to say more than the essential, your grandfather would have known what to do with you. I considered that the finest thing anyone has said to me in 38 years. I finished my coffee. I rinsed the pot. I put on my jacket, the well-cut one in a warm camel tone that I bought for myself the week after the Harrington Club luncheon, not as a celebration exactly, but as the specific, considered act of a woman who has decided that the period of strategic invisibility is concluded and that it is time to take up the precise amount of space she has always been entitled to. I have a briefing at 9. The work continues. It always continues. Some days that is the most peaceful sentence I know. Keep your boundaries strong, guard your peace, and I will see you in the next.